I believe I have their support because I am an uncompromising Protestant.
Anything we can do, we will do to end this dreadful nightmare for all time.
Hello and welcome to the Irish History Podcast. My name is Finn Dwyer, and this is part 4 of my exclusive supporter series on the outbreak of the Troubles. Now, the series is based around interviews with Dr. Brian Hanley from the History Department of Trinity College Dublin. As you are probably aware by this point, Brian is an expert in the conflict, and his analysis so far has taken us from the inception of Northern Ireland in the 1920s through decades of discrimination that followed and into the 1960s when change seemed possible. In the last episode, we saw how tensions increased in Northern Ireland in 1968 and 1969 as nationalists faced major opposition when they demanded equal rights. This would see clashes like the Battle of the Bogside, and eventually the British Army were brought in. Today's episode continues the story into 1970 and 1971 as the hopes that a peaceful resolution could be found began to fade, and fade rapidly. Before we dive into this intriguing history, just a quick word of thanks before we begin. As I mentioned at the top, this series is exclusively available for you, the supporters of the show. Without your support, this series and the main show simply would not be possible, and I'm deeply grateful to you. Now, to start today's episode that explores 1970 and 1971, Brian and myself began by looking at the impact the escalating tensions after the Battle of the Bogside had in Dublin. Across the Republic of Ireland, people were calling for action, and there was even talk that the government of the day might intervene militarily in Northern Ireland. Brian's vivid descriptions here convey the gravity of the situation developing in the north.
During the Battle of the Bogside then, there's huge pressure on the government to do something. And Jack Lynch, the Taoiseach, gives a famous broadcast on RTE where he argues that the government can't stand by and let innocent people be injured or perhaps worse. And he basically says that the Irish Army are moving field hospitals to the border areas, and that he calls on the British government to basically do something to prevent violence getting worse in Derry. Now, Lynch's broadcast becomes famous or notorious because many people in the north view it in one of two ways. Loyalists basically believe the Irish Army are being moved up to the border to prepare for an invasion. Nationalists believe the Irish Army are being moved to the border in order to make incursions to protect them. Both sides perceive it really in the same way, but draw different lessons from it. And it does increase the tension and it probably contributes to the increasing violence in Belfast, for example, as well. In reality, the Irish government did want to move troops to the border. They were woefully ill-prepared for any incursions that they might have to take place. But they were using the field hospitals idea as a way to cover that. And it's very interesting that within the Irish Army, as troops, for example, begin to move up from barracks in Cork and elsewhere, as they go through different towns, crowds on the streets are cheering because people do think that this is, an attempt to rescue Northern nationalists. But the Irish Army are of the opinion that they wouldn't be able to do very much and that it could, in fact, turn out very badly. The government are divided. At this point, you begin to see, and I'll take the cynical view, a couple of ministers hadn't been very vocal at all on the north, but begin to become extremely vocal. People like Neil Blaney from Derry, ultimately Kevin Boland, who's also a minister in Dublin. They begin to, at cabinet level, talk about why can't there be an intervention. And in the longer run, people argue an intervention would have forced the UN, the United Nations, to intervene and would have forced international pressure on Britain. But the majority of the cabinet are against an actual armed intervention. And what they do agree to do is set up a fund in order, firstly, the field hospitals are there to treat people who need to come across the border. You also then have a wave of refugees, thousands of people fleeing Belfast and elsewhere who cross the border as well. And the Irish Army have to take care of them. So you now have a refugee crisis with people, huge amount of fundraising. There's a great deal of popular enthusiasm to aid our people. And that's the term that's used. So the Red Cross, the Catholic Church, the trade unions, all kinds of local community bodies begin to set up funds or begin to make premises available for the refugees. Fundraising concerts and so on are put on. Some of the more radical younger people travel across the border, either into Free Derry behind the barricades, or during the fighting in Belfast, for example, there's rallies in Dublin at the General Post Office, sometimes several thousand strong. And people are chanting, "Give us guns," and they're demanding the Irish Army cross the border. And word goes, that the people in Belfast want you to come. So people do try to travel up. Some do actually make it to Belfast. A lot of them make it as far as Dundalk or maybe into Newry and don't get any further. But there is a real mood, popular mood on the streets for intervention. Ultimately, in Dublin, you begin to see clashes between the police, between the Gardaí and demonstrators as well. And there's rioting in the city centre. And there's increasing worry then in the press, for example, in newspapers like the Irish Press, which would have been the most nationalist newspaper and very strongly aligned with the Fianna Fáil government. They begin to argue that things are getting out of hand, that violence in Dublin will do nothing to aid the people in Belfast. But there still is a sense of something's going to happen.
This situation would even see serious rumours circulate in Dublin that high-level officials, all the way up to government ministers, were involved in procuring weapons for nationalist communities coming under attack in Northern Ireland.
Rumours begin to emerge pretty quickly that the money that the government has put aside for medical aid into a kind of central fund, that some of that is being used to buy arms. And there's all kinds of rumours about the Gardaí turning a blind eye to the movement of arms across the border. There's rumours that TDs are, helping people collect arms and equipment. Some of these rumours are true, or they have an element of truth to them. In the atmosphere of August 1969, there isn't really much appetite to try and stop people from aiding Northern nationalists in all kinds of ways. But ultimately then, you begin to find, reports that a couple of government ministers, one Neil Blaney, but also another man, Charles Haughey, who's one of the rising stars of Fianna Fáil, are involved in basically channeling money for arms and equipment to nationalists in the north, to members of the defence committees, and therefore also members of the IRA. Now, what ultimately then ends up in court is what becomes called the arms trial. And it's quite convoluted, really, because a lot of it involves accounts, that are set up for medical aid and arms buying on the continent that goes wrong. And ultimately, most of these weapons don't get to the north. Anyway, rumours that the Irish Army in the spring of 1970 are sent with thousands of gas masks and also thousands of their obsolete equipment, Lee Enfield rifles and so on, which are going to go to defence committees, but this doesn't happen either. And it becomes part of a big faction fight within the cabinet between those loyal to Jack Lynch, the Taoiseach, and those who are pushing for a harder response. Now, Haughey hadn't been notably concerned with the North at all in terms of his career up till this point, but he becomes one of the ministers who's associated with the arms plot. And in the longer run, it kind of helps his nationalist image. Neil Blaney tries to basically put himself at the head of a Republican wing within Fianna Fáil and is forced out of the party. Nothing is proven in court. It's the source of rumours for the next 50 years about who was doing what.
So, while it was clear the wider situation was leading to growing tension across the island, next we moved back to events on the ground across the north through early 1970. The atmosphere was one of uncertainty. There were some who were still hopeful. Brian explained how this hope was based on limited reforms that had been introduced in late 1969 and early 1970.
The violence of August 69 had been a big, big shock to society in the north, obviously, and also in the south. And people had been killed and hundreds had been injured and people had been forced from their homes. And that hadn't happened since the 1930s, really. But then there's a period of calm and there is a hope that the British government will force the unionist government at Stormont to implement reforms. And they do actually implement a series of reforms. Essentially, gerrymandering has gotten rid of, property qualifications and so on are gotten rid of for elections. The Royal Ulster Constabulary, the police, are actually disarmed for a period. Now, that doesn't last too long, but there is a period in which the police don't carry firearms anymore, which was, a big deal. The Special Constabulary, the B Specials, are disbanded. And for nationalists, that's obviously seen as a huge positive result. They'd be the most hated, really, section of the unionist government's apparatus. Now, there is a very intense loyalist reaction to that, which is to resent all these reforms and actually to fight. So in October 1969, after the B Specials are disbanded, there's rioting on the Shankill in Belfast. And the British Army are sent into the Shankill and they're confronted by people throwing stones and petrol bombs and so on. And eventually there's sniper fire directed at them. And the British Army respond and shoot dead 2 civilians. Now, people at the time say both men were unarmed. They story is very, very similar to one that we'll see over the next few years in the north, where the British Army claim one thing and local people claim another. The loyalists, probably the Ulster Volunteer Force, who are sniping, shoot dead a policeman, Constable Victor Arbuckle. So the first policeman who's killed in the conflict is killed by loyalists. So there's quite serious disturbances in urban loyalist Belfast, but there's also a great deal of resentment elsewhere. And the unionist establishment, again, take another shift towards the right. Brian Faulkner, who's the Prime Minister, begins to essentially try and push back against the British government's desire for more reforms. But things are calming down. So you have a period where into the early part of 1970, the British Army is in place all across the north, but they're not in conflict really with people. You have the kind of what's later called the honeymoon period in nationalist communities between the army and locals. And that can be exaggerated, but there is a truth to it. So you see in Derry in Christmas 1969, British soldiers asking, can they spend their leave in Derry itself? Because so many of them are going out with local girls. You see, soldiers able to, walk around unarmed, go to cinemas, go to pubs and so on as well in different parts of the north. But the British Army have moved into cities and towns across the north and have begun to establish bases there. In many cases, they're now doing the policing because the RUC are not welcome in nationalist West Belfast or in the Bogside and so on, particularly in the urban areas, less so in rural areas. So the British Army are effectively doing some kind of patrolling, but they're also cooperating with local defence committees, and there's a lot of liaison. The Republican movement is on the ground, is reorganising, has had a split, but nevertheless, it's not actively engaged in an armed campaign, any section of it up to that point. So I think there is a period of calm, and you've got people like John Hume and others on the nationalist side who are arguing that over a longer term period, reforms can be introduced and maybe government in Northern Ireland will become workable with a greater nationalist component to it.
However, in hindsight, there were many worrying signs that these hopes were false optimism. What seemed like casual violence and rioting was becoming more and more common. As Brian explains, however, this was deeply political in origin. There was also a change of government in London that did not augur well for the future.
I suppose, again, retrospectively, you can see that at ground level, the violence of 1969 had a big impact in Belfast, and that particularly among young people, relations had broken down. That kind of period in the 60s where there was much more mixing is really now going into reverse. And particularly among working class young people and maybe working class young men around things like football and other social outlets, clashes are happening all the time. And on the loyalist side, a lot of the men who will later become active in the Ulster Defence Association or the Ulster Volunteer Force, they're kind of cutting their teeth in what become known as tartan gangs. And they're based around football and around music. And they're basically young working class men wearing the kind of the skinhead or the boot boy style who are clashing with nationalists whenever they can in Belfast city centre or along the interfaces of different areas in local estates and so on. And their view is that Northern Ireland is being sold down the river. And that kind of street level view is being given political expression by Ian Paisley. And also Paisley now has emerged as an independent unionist. He launches his own Democratic Unionist Party, which is a rival to the old Unionist Party. But the old Unionist Party itself has shifted to the right, as O'Neill was removed and replaced by Chichester Clark, and then Chichester Clark is replaced by Brian Faulkner. So they're also taking a hard line, and they're still in government. So the government is still in Belfast, still at Stormont, and it's still a majority unionist government. And the British Army are under the control of the unionist government to an extent. And they're on the ground right across the north, and the police are still policing city centres and loyalist areas, but not really going into nationalist districts. And, I think the Dublin government and constitutional nationalists are hoping that the British government will press on with reforms and then maybe will override unionist objections. The British government has other fish to fry. The general election in Britain in 1970 and Labour are replaced by the Conservatives. I think people agree that the new Conservative administration is more sympathetic to the unionists and isn't going to push reform as quickly. There's a whole myriad of things happening on the ground as well, where certainly by Easter 1970, you're beginning to see more regular confrontations between nationalist youths and the British Army. And that while there might have been a honeymoon for some people in the nationalist community, for teenage boys and young men in particular, the army start to become a target. They resent the presence of British soldiers. They resent the fact that soldiers are asking them their names and addresses, patrolling their streets. And of course, they have a ready-made historical reference point that this is the British Army. It's not our army. They're an occupation force. Whatever about 6 months ago, and whatever about when they were fighting loyalists, which again, nationalists tend to look on that with a kind of mixture of, maybe the British Army are doing something good or, but now around Easter, when there's Republic commemorations and so on, they tend to end with youths clashing with British troops. So British troops in riot gear are now being deployed in nationalist areas. People are being hurt and so on. And therefore there's resentment building up against the British Army as well.
It was in the summer of 1970 that the last hopes faded as clashes between nationalists and the British Army became more and more frequent, and the so-called honeymoon period between the army and the population came to an end.
What are becoming kind of very common confrontations between British troops and nationalist youths begin to escalate into the summer of 1970, particularly in Ballymurphy in West Belfast, where there's quite serious rioting. The summer months begin to see the resumption of orange parades and so on. And these are obviously seen by nationalists as expressions of triumphalism. But they're also now going past areas where young people are just going to come out and protest or indeed attack the parades, and the British Army are in the position of defending them. So this rioting becomes extremely serious. British troops use rubber bullets and CS gas to try and quell the riots. They also, because they're soldiers, they're brutal very often in their tactics. So a lot of youngsters are being beaten up or having their heads split with batons or being shot at close range with rubber bullets and so on. And because the rioters are using petrol bombs very often, the British Army regard a petrol bomb as a potentially fatal weapon. So the head of the British Army in Northern Ireland says that his soldiers have the right to shoot dead petrol bombers. And this obviously escalates things, and both IRAs then state that if the British Army shoots civilians, they will retaliate. And this has, markedly increases tension into the summer.
The outbreak of the Troubles is best understood as a sequence of very serious events rather than one day when Northern Ireland moved from peace to war. We've already seen a few notable events, particularly the Battle of the Bogside in 1969. The summer of 1970 in Belfast witnessed several more. Brian continues the story.
What really, I suppose, brings things to a head is that there are clashes between nationalists and loyalists over a weekend in late June 1970 around orange marches and demonstrations, but they escalate and sniping begins and several Protestants are shot dead around East Belfast. And a large loyalist crowd attacks a nationalist enclave around the Short Strand, particularly the landmark would be St. Matthew's Church. If you go back in oral history, both communities have completely divergent views of what happened there. But certainly thousands of loyalists, some of whom were armed, were converging on St. Matthew's. And the Provisional IRA and local Defence Committee members, who were also armed, opened fire on the crowd. And there's gun battles that take place over several hours. The British Army don't intervene. They later claimed that they hadn't got the manpower because there was rioting taking place in different parts of the city. But during the fighting, 4 Protestants are shot dead, and obviously many more are injured. One of the defenders, who's actually not a member of the IRA, he's a member of what was actually called the Catholic Defence League in Short Strand, is killed. But a senior Provisional IRA leader, Billy McKee, is badly wounded. And the Provisionals kind of regard that as making their mark in terms of communal defence. And it certainly raises the stakes. The Loyalists obviously see it as an outrage. They're asking, where were the army? Why didn't the army intervene? And over the next week, the British Army then begin raiding nationalist districts looking for arms. And they raid the Lower Falls area of Belfast at the start of July. They find a certain amount of weapons. The Lower Falls was an area that was still regarded as a stronghold of the official IRA. I think the view is that they couldn't let the British Army take these weapons without putting up a fight. So they began to respond. They opened fire on troops and so on. And the British Army imposed a curfew over a wide part of the Lower Falls. Now, again, this is the United Kingdom in 1970. So the British Army have some troops just arriving off the boat. So there's over 1,000 British soldiers. The area is saturated in CS gas. Soldiers move in behind armoured personnel carriers and armoured cars. Republicans are firing at them. The army are firing back. The British Army admit to firing something like 2,000 live rounds during it. 4 civilians are killed. No soldiers are killed. About 18 of them are wounded. There's hundreds of young people on the streets rioting as well, throwing petrol bombs and stones and so on at the British Army. But as the British Army move in then, they begin an extensive search of the area, which involves, going house to house. And in numerous cases, and television pictures at the time show this, They smash into houses, they smash up televisions, they tear out fittings. There's a lot of complaints that they smash religious statues and so on as well. And a lot of nationalists believe that this is the work particularly of Scottish soldiers. And I think there's several regiments involved, but the Scottish ones are blamed. And ultimately, the Falls curfew alienates a huge swathe of nationalist working class Belfast from the British Army. And the British Army's behaviour, the fact that they've killed civilians, the fact that they've, wrecked people's homes is just seen as unacceptable. And even though it happens in Belfast, it has a knock-on effect across the north. And increasingly then, a section of the nationalist population are saying the British Army are just going to do what the Unionists tell them. Kind of even reaffirmed that further. 2 Unionist MPs were brought on a tour of the Lower Falls in a British Army jeep in the aftermath of the fighting. It's almost as if they were being brought, around a conquered area.
This escalation through the summer of 1970 resulted in both the provisional and official IRA responding with increased attacks.
Both the official and provisional IRA step up attacks on the British Army over the autumn of 1970. And you also begin to have unexplained or unclaimed bomb attacks on electricity pylons and on substations and on other buildings and so on, that at the time nobody's quite sure why these bombs are going off, but they start. British Army shoot dead another civilian who they claim is a Petra bomber in late July. At this point, really, nationalists are feeling that the British Army can kill people, claim that they were under attack, claim that they were being sniped at and so on, and that there's very little official investigation into any of that. And the behaviour of troops themselves then, particularly in Belfast and Derry, where there has been trouble, is extremely aggressive, in your face. They're no longer welcome in nationalist areas, and they know that, and they're no longer behaving in any way gently in nationalist areas either. So the scene is really set for kind of further radicalization into the next year.
Amidst this conflict, there was a general polarization. Calls for reform were increasingly ignored, creating a dynamic where more radical Republicans gained traction in nationalist communities.
The events on the ground and the clashes between the army and nationalists and so on meant that increasingly the Republican argument, which was crudely that the British had to go for there to be any kind of justice for nationalists and that you needed a united Ireland, is getting a bigger hearing than for 50 years. The Republican organisations are recruiting and becoming more visible and more confident. At the same time, the constitutional nationalist, the old nationalist party, is basically replaced by the Social Democratic and Labour Party, which is a party made up of people like John Hume, but also then former Labour politicians like Paddy Devlin and Jerry Fitt. Their idea of pushing for reform comes up against a brick wall of unionist resistance, because the unionists effectively argue that they're now facing a guerrilla campaign. They're facing an insurrection, and therefore that the police have to be rearmed, which ultimately they are. The Special Constabulary are replaced by a new regiment of the British Army called the Ulster Defence Regiment. And in many cases, people who had been special constables just joined the Ulster Defence Regiment. So that it ultimately becomes the biggest regiment in the British Army. It's locally recruited in Northern Ireland as well. And the unionists are clear that really, what more can they do? Nationalists now have got, as far as they're concerned, everything that the civil rights movement had asked for, and yet things seem to be continually getting worse. So riots are commonplace now. Throwing stones at soldiers is a pastime for youngsters, and the army's response is often brutal again. So again, people are being hurt or badly injured or sometimes killed by the British Army into early 1971, and the IRA. The IRAs are continually targeting the police and army as well. And even though it hasn't become a war as yet, it's quite clear that it's in no way normal. Again, bomb explosions, particularly in Belfast, becoming relatively common at this point as well. Demands on the loyalist side for harsher measures, the reorganisation on the loyalist side of local defence associations and more secretive groups like the Ulster Volunteers, who are talking about, defending with arms what they see as the Northern Ireland state as their state.
Hopefully, you're getting the sense that in early 1971, Northern Ireland appeared to be drifting towards war. A few firsts took place that year, and these were more of those key milestones we talked about earlier. Brian captures some of these developments.
When you look back at the conflict, a lot of it at times it's punctuated by kind of landmarks, and In February 1971, the Provisional IRA killed a British soldier. And I mean, they'd been trying to do that for quite a while, but ultimately they do it in February 1971. And following that, Gunner Robert Curtis, who's killed on a night in which a Catholic civilian and an IRA member are also killed by the British Army. The Prime Minister, Brian Faulkner, says that Northern Ireland is now at war with the Irish Republican Army provisionals. And this is the kind of unionist view now, that this is a security problem that has to be solved. Now, at this point, the British Army are using deadly force fairly regularly. And it isn't until the 1980s that a British soldier is jailed for killing a civilian. So it's clear to a lot of people that the British Army will kill people and get away with it. And they'll lie about what they're doing as well. And there is real conflict on the streets on a regular basis between certainly urban nationalist youth and the British Army. And the IRA, the Provisional IRA, are beginning to up the level of violence, because they begin to see this as the opportunity to really push for a campaign to drive the British out of Ireland. The officials are also attacking the army as well. They claim it's a policy of defence and retaliation, and that the time isn't right for an armed struggle, but nevertheless, they still have to respond. So the violence is getting worse, and the Provisional IRA also it becomes clear that they're responsible for at least some of these bombings, and that they're beginning a bombing campaign. Starts off at quite a low level and begins to escalate into the summer of 1971.
1971 also saw the beginning of a Provisional IRA bombing campaign. To some, this has seemed nonsensical. They were detonating bombs in the cities where they lived. I asked Brian about the logic behind this strategy of bombings. He now explains the thinking behind it and how the strategy revealed the extent of alienation among many nationalists in Northern Ireland.
The Provisional IRA begins to develop a campaign in 1971, which is partially targeted directly at the British Army and then other members of the state forces as well, but also is an economic campaign and in part a publicity campaign. The vast majority of Northern Ireland's businesses and commercial establishments were unionist owned, and the apparatus of the state was very much seen as unionist. So what Republicans believed was one way of ensuring that Northern Ireland couldn't be viewed as passive or quiet is to carry out small-scale bombings generally, which continually make the news and also show that the security forces aren't able to enforce control over parts of the north, but also in retaliation for British Army raids and so on in nationalist districts, that you begin to bomb the centre of Belfast or you begin to bomb the centre of Derry in order to weaken the state economically, it was thought, weaken the British Exchequer economically, cause lots of damage, but also then to disrupt daily life, make it clear that this isn't a normal situation, and also retaliate then for particular actions by the state forces. So the logic would have been that, you know, if the British Army are going to wreck houses in West Belfast, then the centre of Belfast is going to be disrupted by bombs and bomb scares and so on. Now, from a pretty early stage, IRA volunteers are being killed by their own bombs, and civilians are being killed or injured by bombs as well. And this is at a point when the bombs are usually being placed by individuals or by groups of people and are just a few sticks of gelignite or so on, and a short fuse and shouted warnings or short timers and so on. They do become more sophisticated and more deadly as well, even over the next year into 1972. But they are an important part of the Provisional IRA's arsenal in particular.
1971 also saw the British Army adopt an even more aggressive approach, leading to large numbers of civilian casualties. Life was anything but normal by this point.
I think it's become clearer that the British Army in the north judges that this is a military problem that they could solve by basically taking the war to the IRA. That if they're given legislative powers and backup, they can lure the IRA out and defeat them in a military sense. And the bulk of civilians killed by the British Army are really killed in those years, in 1970, 71, 72. And it shows the kind of tactics they were using. A lot of it very influenced by what they'd done in Aden in the late 60s and even in Kenya and other parts of the empire as well, in its kind of declining years in the 50s and 60s.
As we've seen, the first half of 1971 witnessed a dramatic escalation in violence. However, the late summer would bring yet another of the milestones along what was becoming a road to war. This was the internment of large numbers of Republicans, which led to a major reaction from the Republican movement.
In March 1971, 3 off-duty British soldiers were Scottish, 2 of them were brothers, are killed. At the time, this causes intense shock, and the IRA deny any involvement, which again shows you that they're aware that the nationalist community won't tolerate everything. Now, they were killed by the IRA, and were probably killed by members of the IRA in Ardoyne, who took the decision on themselves to do it. But there's a huge backlash among loyalists, partially because the soldiers were Scottish and because they're very young. And there's marches demanding the introduction of internment. And the loyalist community are pushing. You begin to see shootings and bombings, which later on become clear it's being done by loyalists as well, into the summer of 1971. And the Unionist government does make a decision at some point to try and basically arrest as many potential suspects as possible and allow the British Army leeway then to go in and clear out the IRA from nationalist districts. So internment is introduced in early August 1971. Now, internment had been introduced in almost every decade of Northern Ireland's existence, and it had very often worked. It had also been introduced in the 26 counties and in the Republic of Ireland as recently as 1957 to 61. And it had kind of worked then too. And it worked on the basis that the IRA was fairly isolated from the broader community. And therefore, if you arrested enough IRA members and put them in jail, aside from their own supporters, very few people cared. The situation in August 1971 was very, very different. The nationalist community, or big sections of it, were severely alienated from the Northern Ireland state. They're disappointed by what seems to be the failure to carry through civil rights reforms. They feel abandoned by the British government, which is allowing the Unionists, it looks like, to do what they want. And the British Army are now quite clearly on the side of the Unionists. So when internment is introduced and over 300 men are arrested initially, they're all nationalists. They're all either Republicans or members of civil rights groups or members of left-wing groups. Some of them are very elderly veterans of Republican organizations and so on. And it's quite clear that the state is only interested in dealing with violence from one part of the population. Also becomes clear pretty quickly that a lot of the internees are being ill-treated, routinely beaten up and so on. And also that a number of them have been selected for what are called special interrogation techniques, where they're basically tortured and, subjected to all kinds of white noise, sleep deprivation, and so on. And this becomes fairly widespread knowledge. Now, the violence had been increasing, but the days after internment are the worst that the North had experienced since the 1920s. Over 30 people are killed. Gunfire is general in Belfast and in Derry and in Newry and so on. And even the smallest nationalist village or town explodes in terms of demonstrations and riots. The Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association calls people back onto the streets, calls for civil disobedience. There's a rent and rate strike, and there's walkouts by mainly nationalist workforces. And then you also have gun battles along interfaces between loyalists and Republicans, gun battles involving the British Army, obviously. You have, of course, 10 people killed in the Ballymurphy area over a few days after the introduction of internment. And you also have thousands of people forced from their homes. In fact, more people forced from their homes in the aftermath of internment than in August 1969. So the mixed areas really, again, become one thing or the other. Many Protestants, for example, leave their homes in North Belfast around Ardoyne and move into mainly Protestant areas. And thousands flee south as well. So you've got another wave of refugees into the Republic on a much bigger scale than had been the case in 1969.
It's clear that Northern Ireland was sliding into war. But if we are to understand the beginning of the Troubles as a process, this would only be complete in early 1972, when the levels of violence would surpass even what had been experienced in 1971. That's the focus of the next episode. But before concluding this podcast, I asked Brian more about where we started the show, and that's events in the Republic of Ireland. Although not directly affected by the violence in the north, some increasingly feared it might spill over. And just like with his opening descriptions, he now gives the sense of gravity of the situation across the island of Ireland.
In August 69 and thereafter, there's a wave of enthusiasm for doing something to help nationalists in the north. And you've got demonstrations in Dublin, and indeed you have riots in Dublin in August 1969, over 3 nights, clashes in the city centre between the Gardaí and demonstrators who'd marched in the British Embassy, and then also large elements of what you might call the Dublin crowd. Youngsters join in the rioting, and this becomes a factor that's noted by the press, that a lot of these kids hadn't been on the marches, but they join in the fighting afterwards. So there's potential really to destabilise the South to some extent. You also have then, trade unions and other bodies collecting money for relief funds for the North. You have thousands of refugees coming south and they need to be housed. Most of them ultimately go back over the next few months. And the North has come back centre stage.
In the next instalment, that's part 5 of this exclusive 6-part series on the outbreak of the Troubles, we'll look at the Bloody Sunday Massacre, an event that would be central to how the Troubles evolved. As always, thank you for your support. As I said at the top of the show, this series would not be possible without you. Until next time, Slán.